Hello and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today we say hello to Yang of Akita Software. Hey Jean, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks so much for joining. We talked a little while ago, and back then I know that you were kind of targeting API people, sort of the API space. And now we talked a little more, and we just talked about how your new customer base, so to speak, is non-API people and how you are converting non-API people to API people. So this is what we will talk about today. I'm really curious to hear your story, how your story or the story of Akita evolved. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so at the beginning of Akita, so we started out not particularly focused around APIs, and then we realized APIs are really the perfect abstraction. I mean, they were there all along. And then now we're bringing that journey to everybody else. Because when we started Akita, the goal was really to help developers make sense of their complex software systems that are distributed across services, and how code gets distributed across services is the APIs. But we were really going after the problem. Well, there's a lot of code, there's a lot of data flowing across all these services. How do we make sense of it? And my motivation was this: software has become more like an ecosystem. It's like a rainforest, not a centrally planned garden anymore. And people might be, the APIs are really what enables this to happen, because every team is working on their individual piece, and sometimes people agree on what the interfaces to those pieces should be beforehand. But the people who have really embraced microservices or really embraced a lot of API use or SaaS, a lot of these very modern companies, they haven't. And so initially we were going at different angles, helping people make sense of them. We're really going after it in a systems way. So we thought maybe we should integrate with open telemetry, maybe we should integrate with Envoy or something like that, service mesh kind of things. But then we were like, no, there's been no real standardization around that. And so we looked to the one place where there has been standardization. And there has been standardization because people have made it so, because people have had to communicate with each other, people-to-people communication this way, and that's API protocols. And so we were like, whoa, maybe we should just, watch systems, watch the API traffic, put it in the shape of the protocols, and then that's how we help people make sense of their systems. And so in the beginning, it was people like you, Eric, and people like Kin and Matt McLarty in the API community who really got it, because it was you all who for the last decade, 2 decades have been like, yes, we want standardization around APIs. APIs are the perfect communication medium. And so the API community was who got it in the beginning. But what we found was people who are API first, who are API spec first, especially, they're like, look, we may not have a centrally planned garden, but we have this nice catalog already of everything in our rainforest. We don't, we're not as underwater. Whereas these super modern, like spin up a new microservice every day kind of companies, they're like, yeah, we don't know what our APIs are, or not even super modern, but companies with a lot of legacy stuff, layers and layers and layers. They weren't necessarily, API first about any of it. They're like, yeah, we have no clue what's going on. Things are a mess. We can't even migrate off of the old things. And so the people who have ended up using our tool are people who want to make sense of their systems. They know they've got a rainforest. They don't want a planned garden. And they're starting to see the ways of, APIs are a nice way to understand my system. This is how the machine, well, us, Akita, is communicating with them. And ultimately, I think they'll appreciate how people can communicate better using APIs as well.
I think that story also reflects a lot of what I hear. I call these things accidental APIs, because whenever, we go to companies and sometimes we come to a company and they say, yeah, we just get started with APIs. We don't have any. And then I always tell them, no, you have lots of them. You just have no idea where they are and what they do. but I'm sure you have connected systems, right? So
right. Connected systems talking across the network, because that's the only way to scale your modern systems. And you're probably starting to call external APIs. So we talk to companies now, they're calling Slack API, Stripe API, Twilio API. It just creeps up. Like the developers are just bringing it in. I was calling these accidental distributed systems, but you're exactly right there. When you have an accidental distributed system these days, it's an accidental set of APIs.
One of the things that we did a little, actually it's in the continuous API management book. One of the things we have in there, it's called API archaeology. It's something that we did with companies, let's talk about your accidental APIs, because then now you have to understand what you even have, and B, which may not be quite what you're after, but I think for some companies it's interesting to also figure out which of those would actually benefit from becoming like a proper and a better managed API that people can use in a more open way, right? Yeah. Because I think what you discover is probably a lot of, like you say, really messy stuff that is hard to operate and hard to change. Particularly, hard to change in a robust way.
Yeah. It seems like our sweet spot is what we call one-click observability. So last time we talked, I mentioned there are observability tools. They help you with logs, metrics, traces, but the catch was you have to know what your services are to install them. You have to, you have to drop them into a service at a time. You often have to instrument the service. And so what people have been telling me is like, look, I know we use some API over there. I barely know what it is. I'm not going to go install some instrumentation into there because I don't know what it is and it's not mine. What we've been really working on is this passive traffic monitoring. So, drop us into a Kubernetes host or drop us in on the network. We listen to the traffic, and then we sort of like, those plans, just add water, just add network access to us. And we'll start telling you, okay, this is your APIs, this is how they're talking to each other. And we're not aimed at being like the power tool. We're not aimed to have like precise, like everything, you can instrument everything, or you can like exactly make your API models like what you intended them to be. But we're sort of like, just like a 80% on day one solution. Drop us in anywhere, we'll tell you some stuff.
That is nice. I like that as a very effective tool for API archaeology.
It's just like a big flashlight. It's not the one that you're gonna do like dental surgery with, but.
Yeah. But again, right, like at least to get started, like you say, right, the typical 80-20 thing, right, where you say, well, at least I get 80% visibility. Yeah. That's already much better than zero.
Right. And day to day, like, I did a survey on my Twitter, everyone who's using OpenTelemetry, which I had thought was, this is the greatest. You can just like power instrument your system. You can understand everything. And what we were hearing was people are like, we use it. We'd love to use it everywhere. So I think we get a lot of questions. Okay, like we're using OpenTelemetry. How is this still useful? My next question is, okay, what percentage of your services is OpenTelemetry installed on right now? Where do you think you're going to get in the next year? And then they're like, oh yeah, okay.
That is a very good point, right? Only because like the last half year of API development was really nice and coordinated. That doesn't mean that your whole API landscape, like you still have mostly a jungle, right? There's this nice little new garden.
Right.
Most of it is jungle.
Yeah, because I think, companies will be like, we switched to GraphQL and everything's going to be good now. So I'm like, okay, what percentage of APIs are GraphQL? And like, how fast is that switch gone? So yeah, we're exactly this, like, I wouldn't say we're like the junk hauling of your legacy APIs, but we kind of are. Like, I guess, if everything were like this planned garden, and my view is it's not, and it's never going to be. That's sort of a unachievable ideal, because by the time you switch to OpenTelemetry or whatever that nice telemetry thing is, by the time you switch to GraphQL or like the newest, hottest IDL, there's going to be a new one. And you're going to have that, like 5% of my things are in this new one now.
Yes, that is very true. And I think whenever you have things where you can help people with as less invasive as
Yeah.
possible, that's always good, because then you don't have to put constraints on people, like you said, right? It's like you can only use this toolkit or this language because that's the
Yeah.
only one where we can actually install this observability tool, right? And
Yeah.
then that's a really big constraint that you're putting on all of your teams. So if you can avoid that, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think it fits really nicely with just the API first methodology, because you guys aren't dictating which APIs people are using, but the tools are all actually very API protocol specific. And so I think that to help people become more API first, to help people become aware of their specs, to have a spec in the loop. I think that this is a bit controversial in the API community, but I used to be like, oh yeah, spec first all the way, and now I'm like, well, it's sort of like spec in the loop. You have a spec sometime, maybe at the beginning, maybe at the middle, maybe at the end.
I think it does make some sense. Just today, I just find that kind of an interesting little side story. Just today, there was the story that Google now has this new label they put on some APIs, and the label is Google Enterprise API. So it's kind of meant to be like a quality label, where they say this API is very carefully managed to be stable. We only change it in very specific ways. Whenever we change it, there's a long review process to make sure that we really don't break anybody. So it's kind of like, these are this nice little garden there where it's like, these are the high quality enterprise
those are
level
spec
APIs.
Yeah, specs are first class thing there. Yeah.
Specs first class, right? A lot of quality attributes attached to it. But in terms of the whole Google API jungle, right? Like the enterprise APIs probably are 0.1%, probably less.
Yeah, they're like the nice windows on the outside of your house that if you photograph, you photograph in front of those. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's important. I always like that also when you start looking at your landscape or your jungle, whatever, right? And you say, you know what, it's not going to be one size fits all. It's always going to be, I do certain things a certain way, right? So for public APIs, I may have just a different way of I manage them, which is more expensive, but it makes sense because I want those quality attributes. And then for my private ones, right, I have a different methodology. I still want some control maybe, but I'm willing to kind of have a different balance.
Yeah, and this is part of the evolution of us realizing who our audience was. We learned at some point it's not API teams, because in the beginning when we said APIs a lot, API teams would show up and they'd be like, well, we have a spec already. Why would we use this? And then what we realized was internal teams suffer from a ton of API problems. Because if you think about, Google Enterprise APIs, great practices, change slowly, tell everybody exactly what happens whenever people change. That's the user-friendly thing to do. But the whole point of the rise of services, the rise of using APIs internally is you move fast. Anyone can change anything any day and things should still work together. So when you scale that up, the internal APIs are the places where I am imposing this kind of process is actually taking away all of the gains of this new kind of architecture. And so what we found is that seems to be a sweet spot also for companies where the external API may not be as mature. There's no API team yet, but there is an API. That's the place where people are like, yeah, we change a lot and people get hurt by it. And we get hurt because we're up late fixing it. Whereas the API teams, they're like, look, our whole job is to make sure this changes slowly and predictably. And so if we used you, it would help us a little bit, but this, we've got this under control. We fought this fight already. Yeah.
So coming back to our initial topic where you said, you're secretly converting is what you said once.
Yeah.
You're secretly converting people to API people. So I think, right, that what that means when we dissect a little bit is that you show people that they are actually using APIs, even though if you ask them, they might not even say it that way. I mean, are there people who are at that level, basically, where you tell them, look, we look at your APIs to help you, and then they say, we didn't even know we have any?
Right. So I think they think of the APIs as services, endpoints. This is stuff I'm calling. I think if you said, "Well, do you use APIs?" They'd be like, "Yeah, well, yeah, I guess so." But I think they're not thinking of it necessarily from the point of view of the API specification or what's going on around the endpoints. It's not an endpoint centric view of it. I would say I don't know if this is too technical of an analogy for your crowd, but it's like back when programmers were using assembly language, they were using functions. They were, they were in their heads kind of abstracting things into like this piece of functionality calls that piece of functionality. Otherwise, you just can't scale thinking. But in the code, it wasn't like that. And similarly, a lot of the people who are, doing observability today, they're trying to hunt down what's happening with their systems at the level of network logs or metrics of like this is this endpoint is like this. But really what we're trying to show them is overlaid on top of all of this is the graph of API communications. And so if you think about your debugging, a lot of the questions are what services are calling me, what services am I calling, how does everything fit together? And so, lifting up that level of abstraction for thinking about your systems to the API level can be very helpful. And holding that graph in your head instead of just one pairwise API communication at a time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thinking of it, I have two rather specific questions, just out of curiosity. One of them is that a lot of the problems that I think we see in big organizations is that people are kind of accessing databases in a very open way, right? So there is some database that has a very complex data model in it, and people happily just query away and do whatever. So that is also, I think, a little bit of that complexity where nobody really knows what happens because there's just this magical endpoint that everybody goes through.
Right.
Is that something where you can help as well, or would that be a different tooling basically that would be more kind of at the database level?
Yeah, so that's something a lot of people have asked us about. So people have said, I want to know what happens with my data store or my data stream. We don't handle that today, but there's actually no reason why this kind of approach couldn't. So we've been talking to some people who are interested in using us for Kafka. And so like Kafka messages happen a slightly different way. We would have to be able to handle that. But what, the people who come to us and say, hey, can you handle Kafka? What they're realizing is, hey, I have all these Kafka problems. This is just another API. What they said was, thinking about things in terms of your API tool actually helped me realize that this is just another API, where I thought of this as like, oh, I need to think about, my interactions with Kafka. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's all
example,
yeah.
But to some extent, I think it's similar because, Kafka as well as the database example I was talking about, right? Both of them are potentially like these little holes into vastly complex data.
Right.
All the events going through Kafka or all the data that is in a database. So it's like graph. It's like another graph.
Right. Exactly. Right? Yeah. So if you the general, approach of I sit at APIs, or, Akita sits at APIs, Akita watches the traffic, if we just have to build something that can understand different protocols, but there's there aren't really limitations. There are some limitations about what we can do now. For instance, we try to be really protective of people's data, so we don't actually read any data off of the system. And so sometimes people want to know, I want to know properties of my Kafka messages. So then we're like, okay, we would like that would take a bit of work for us to build because we have to do that all on your side. And then send off, metadata to our side somehow. But so that's not something we can turn around in a week. But yeah, the general, I think something we are helping people realize is once we tell people, well, we listen to all your APIs when we tell you stuff, and then they think, okay, well, like what problems do I have that are API problems? Wow, everything is an API problem. Not everything, but a lot more than they thought.
That is true. And the one thing you just said actually kind of took away, not quite, but my second question. So you talked about, stuff that you do and stuff that is maybe on premise or like with customers. And that was like, my question is like, the stuff you do potentially, of course, reaches really deep into what happens in some companies, and depending on what the company is doing and how how much secrets they have, right? Some might feel really protective about that. So I was just wondering, like, how is that managed right now in terms of
Right.
being as a service or on premise, or
Yeah,
looks like you have a
that's a
balance
really
of those two?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the conventional wisdom for a lot of startups of our stage is the minute you move on-prem, you stop getting all the data to learn. So we have tried to keep things as a service as much as possible. But our compromise has been we don't send any payloads and we don't send any sensitive data to ourselves. So we have an agent that sits in our user systems. It watches the API traffic. It does a salted hash for all of the request response data. We never unhash that. And so what we're getting back on our servers is the metadata of the requests and the responses. And then also what our agent does is it does basic type inference and basic heuristics for inferring is there sensitive data or things like that. So we'll have inference for, is this a string, is this an integer, and we can also go more precise than that. So we have a set of fixed data types, like a few RFCs of date time, US phone number, international phone number, and we'll do all of that inference while we have the data, and then we'll send everything back to ourselves. So people have asked, well, can you like give me examples using my own data? And we're like, well, that's really hard for us to do right now because we don't see your data. And so I think we can build up our agent to potentially start storing that stuff and somehow feed that into the dashboarding. But yeah, like to keep the data safe. I think also when we're a bigger company, we'll have more bandwidth to do more on-prem and do more, like that. But yeah, right now we're trying to be SaaS as much as possible, just because like it helps us scale. We're a very small team. We need to learn what's actually useful for people. So if we have these slow on-prem use cycles, it'll take us 15 years to get the product right.
Yeah, and I totally understand. And then supporting all kinds of weird deployment models that
Right.
people want to see, right, is really, really hard and expensive to do. And I
Right.
think you have to come up with something that strikes a good balance, what's easy for you and what's acceptable for the customers that you're targeting.
Right. Because I think our view is, well, no one really has done this one-click API centric observability before. We're not going to get it right the first time, and so we've just been deploying every week, seeing, okay, are we getting closer to the thing that is immediate for you? People are like, no, I still have to do like these 5 things. We're like, okay, so like if it were on-prem, this would take so much longer because we can see exactly what people are doing right now. We can see where they get stuck.
But it really would be interesting. So thanks for all these explanations. I find that fascinating, in particular because what you do is you now target people who are, I would say, early on their API journey.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? They don't even know that they are on their API journey.
Yeah, I think they are API users, but that's not their worldview isn't API centric, and so they're using non-API centric observability now. We're trying to convert them to additionally having this API centric layer.
I think there will be so much to learn from you. The more you reach that crowd and learn what they're doing, I think it also will be just super interesting to think about what is the smoothest and best way to get them to a little bit, like at least identify these little gardens, right? Coming back to the jungle and garden,
right. Yeah,
we just have a jungle, and at least now we start like having this little garden because we think that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, and I think that mix will be really interesting because there's really 2 opposing forces happening right now. There's so for people who have the external API, and so people often cite Stripe as a company who they've poured immense tooling into their external APIs. They have their own homegrown framework for doing that, but they are a fast-moving, high-growth startup, and for their internal APIs, it's like night and day. And so I think like and they're not even the most modern of architectures, but if you think about like the companies that use a ton of microservices, so they have the APIs are very useful for internal stuff, and it's just things are happening very fast. And so what people are finding is API gateways they're sort of like taking a planned garden view of the world. They're not working for these internal APIs. Some people are building API micro gateways, but I think that like there's going to be a ton of innovation in the next 10 years or so to kind of bridge, like, well, how do we plan some parts and not plan some other parts? There's not, like, how do we not hold back the speed that you get from using internal APIs while having sanity everywhere? And I think it'll be really interesting.
I like that you're mentioning gateways. It's interesting for me to look. So as you know, right, Xway, the company I work for, right? So we have a gateway, but I think we also realize what you said, right? That in some way, these gateways sometimes are kind of holding people back a little bit because they become like this. In this garden, only those rules apply, and you have to do this and that. But what we're doing now is basically we said at least, instead of just having the gateway, we now have like what we call a catalog, and then we say you can handle a variety of gardens,
exactly,
right?
that
And like
hybrid
this garden works different from that, and so we'll see how that goes. But I think like the general idea, like you said, right, there's going to be a lot of innovation. There's going to be like this always this balance between yes, APIs are important, but we also don't want to overmanage them and to slow us down again.
Right, but they are everywhere.
Where this is going, yes. Yeah, I know we'll definitely get more and more of those. So that's good for the two of us, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff happening around APIs. I think APIs are the right place to hang system understanding.
Okay, I think this is a very good closing statement, that APIs right now are a very good place basically to just watch how the world gets more and more both connected and complicated, or complex. That's one way.
Yeah, it's where the intentionality meets accidents.
That's very true. And you're helping the people with the accidents.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jean, for joining, and thanks for that very interesting chat. I'm really looking forward to hear more from you after you've converted even more people from normal people to be API people, and see how that works.
Yeah, thank you so much for the interesting conversation. This was really fun.
Okay, thanks everybody for listening, and see you soon. Bye.